I'm Meshal Malik, and you're watching Indus Special. According to the Edelman survey, which has polled thousands of people for over 2 decades, a majority of people around the world believe capitalism in its current form is doing more harm than good. Now, one of the main drivers of our economic system are the big, powerful, flashy corporations. Many of these organizations, often with the use of technology, are finding more innovative ways to make more money. But with this rising distrust in capitalism, are consumers going to change their behavior? And how much power do individuals have, in fact, to bring about a change? Let's discuss this further. Joining us for this discussion is Professor Steve Keen, who's an economist, honorary professor at the University College London. He joins us from London. Also joining us today is Adam Smith, who's a social media expert and contributing editor of PC Magazine UK. He joins us also from London. Thank you both for joining us and welcome to the show. Professor Steve Keen, now when we talk about this growing distrust, what do you think is driving it? What do you feel like has changed in the last couple of years, which is making more consumers wary, more people wary of the current economic system?
I think it's a range of things. Certainly the financial crisis back in 2008 and the complete unpreparedness, not just of the financial sector, but also the academics, economists who didn't see this coming. That was huge. Then we've had the rise in inequality, which has been going on really since the early 1970s. Certainly a lot of the third world benefited from part of that inequality because it involved the transfer of production, which China has done very well out of. But now I think it's also the climate. And people are looking at the climate syndrome we're seeing around the world, the Australian fires, in particular, the most recent indicator. And people are thinking, if this is the system which is supposed to be in equilibrium, it doesn't look like equilibrium to me. And I think that's where the distrust is coming from.
Right. Climate definitely is one of the strongest manifestations of what is wrong with the system that we're talking about here. And we have been trying to link that, especially that's what we're trying to do with this show, to these corporations. I mean, we often take governments to account how they should change, but how should these corporations change? Do you think there is a growing discussion of how to move in a more sustainable manner?
There is, but I think it's too little, too late. I mean, we have the other extreme, of course, of instances like the Boeing 777 or 777 MAX catastrophe, where a complete focus by the firm on maximising profits meant trying to evade regulations. Normally, critics say regulations slow down innovation. These ones slowed down deaths, and the fact the company behaved so badly, I think, has been yet another factor of saying, well, unbridled capitalism dies. Now, the firms are changing slowly. You're getting various companies, including Microsoft now, talking about going carbon negative. Well, that's good, but I think it is far too little too late. And the shift we need away from focusing upon what used to be called share value towards focusing upon sustainability is an enormous shift that I simply can't see enough corporations doing rapidly enough difference to what's coming our way.
Right. Professor Steve, now I do want to jump to Adam, but before that, I would like you to quickly give us a small explainer of what this going carbon negative means.
For Microsoft, what it means is it's trying to ensure that rather than generating carbon, it's in the totality of its operations, taking carbon out of the atmosphere. Not a major. Most go for carbon neutral. In other words, saying that their production, the generation of output, is balanced by other activities which reduce the carbon footprint of the species. So it's rather than say, like, if your servers are being run by a coal-fired power station, then at the same time you're planting trees or you're installing place of the coal-fired, and in the aggregate you emit zero CO2 or less than zero out of your aggregate operations. But it's still much more gradual than what's necessary to get to the point where we have any chance of keeping global warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius.
Right. Now, as Professor Keene mentioned here, that the climate issue has been one of the main reasons why people all around the world have realized the system just isn't working. And while corporations are taking some actions, it is a little too late. But even if we discuss how they have started this movement to become more conscious, how much of a role do you feel the consumers have played in this? And especially with the power of social media calling out big, powerful corporations, how much of a role do you think all of that plays?
I think consumers have played quite a big role in this development. But I think there is still a difference and a disparity between how much consumers influence corporations on their surface and how much change can actually be made by your average consumer. So yes, the rise of social media has absolutely made companies put out a much more global and a much more environmentally friendly face to any of their businesses. And we have seen developments made in that space in order to give a semblance that they are being more eco-friendly. On the other hand, what we do need to remember, and what shouldn't be lost in these discussions, is that these big corporations are still going to be working ultimately for the benefit of their shareholders and for their bottom line. So any work that they do to regulate themselves is always going to be mediated by that philosophy. And that's why ultimately what the best thing consumers can do is put them, in my opinion, is put themselves forward and support, say, government regulation and large industry-wide scale powers that, as Professor Keene pointed out, that would actually have a greater difference rather than relying on the companies to do it themselves. As we've seen many times throughout history, that's not something that always works out.
Right. And we're going to carry that point, but this thing that you're talking about, this creation of this semblance, even a facade of sorts. Now, why do you think companies feel like that's important to do in this day and age?
I think companies think that's important because consumers think that's important. We like to believe that we're investing in companies that reflect our own values. And most of those are liberal values of, say, transparency, of fairness, of eco-friendly behavior. Now, the issue is that when a company, well, more often than not, when a company tries to implement that, that doesn't get to, say, the root of an issue. Now, from a technological perspective, we've had companies use, say, blockchain technology to track how their products move from country to country in order to ensure that everything is being accounted for, everything is transparent, and everything is above board, really. But that doesn't get to the root of the issue. I've seen this used with, say, coffee beans. And the issue is that customers know that, say, coffee growers are being paid a pittance for their work, and companies will go, well, here is our nice transparent system that shows that everything's being kept above board, rather than dealing with the actual issue of coffee workers being paid a pittance. Right. It is a technological plaster over what is a systemic issue. And a systemic issue of capitalism that cannot be fixed by just technology alone. And right. Consumers want to try and deal with the inherent issue, but are being somewhat stalled by these nice faces that companies do put on.
Right. Professor Keene, now Adam, this in a very interesting way, but I do want your take on this as well. Why are companies and corporations, I mean, they have all this power to accumulate all this wealth. They know that their customers are going to continue buying their products. A few will, of course, let go. But why do they continuously feed into or try to prove that they're being more conscious?
Part of its window dressing, as Adam's implying, it's to give yourself a good image. When you still continue behaving in much the same way. But what you've really got is an attempt to hang on to a philosophy which is outdated now. And that's philosophy where everything must be about maximizing shareholder value. And the idea that, you don't worry about your other stakeholders, you don't worry about the workers, you don't worry about the consumers, but the ones you need, you can ignore in some ways what's happening with your workers. What you have to do is make sure you don't get a bad image, and therefore that's where most of the window dressing occurs.
Right. Now, why do you think it is essential about these values and what the consumers represent, what they want to represent, not just for this year or for a couple of years ahead, but for a more sustainable environment and a more sustainable system?
Well, would be what would be desirable. But of course, companies these days, particularly when they're publicly owned, unfortunately, are living to a 3-month reporting cycle. And the concern they have is not about whether they're being socially responsible citizens, but whether they are outperforming their rivals on a 3-month basis. And that attitude, which is endemic in the financial system now, completely distorts any capacity to think, not 30 years, but even 1 year ahead. So we have an entire philosophical foundation of how companies operate, which is completely the opposite of thinking about long-term sustainability.
Right. Adam, now, of course, we're talking about rising consumer consciousness. Do you feel like technology, as it's played a role in in allowing businesses, you mentioned an example of the blockchain there, to, upgrade their systems, to work towards more innovative ways? Do you think technology has provided the same opportunities for consumers to become more conscious and have more power?
I think technology on a whole, no, it hasn't. And because while there may be specific instances, in my opinion, where consumers can find out more about the company, as a general rise of technology and the general rise of this information age, what we have is an overload of technology. What we have is an overload of information where consumers are saturated by things like the replacement of the 24-hour news cycle, like social media, like all that information that's getting constantly fed into us it's too much for someone to bear. Consumers still have that basic foundation, I believe, that things should be fair, things should be right, and will act in those interests on a grand scale. But when it comes to actually going in and finding out about these sort of issues, or even affecting greater change with them, that's something that is very difficult. And we've seen that, all over the world. Just for example, if Flint, Michigan is still, in America, is still without clean drinking water. And this is something that people know, and it's information that we all have. But in terms of actually getting something done, that can be very difficult. So while technology has made it transparent, whether it's made it actionable remains to be seen.
Right. Professor Steve Keen, now 2019 was, of course, a year, and it continues to be in 2020 a year where we see a lot of social movements. We see a lot of people take to the streets, and we've seen a lot of incidents that have forced people to take to the streets. When we talk about capitalism, of course, it's how fires are ranging from all across the world because of policies that the government did not take into consideration the environment. We're seeing economic inequality. All of these discussions are being held. But within the current system that we have, do you think are any policies that are being devised that can find solutions in how to solve these and how to move towards greater sustainability?
No. The only way we can actually move to greater sustainability is having a systems thinking mentality at the top of our governments and corporations. And by systems, what that means is you don't treat your company or even your country in isolation. You see how what changes in one part of the economy affects your company and then feeds back to the economy as well. There's technology which is designed to do that, invented by a man called Jay Forrester back in the 1950s. There are software packages that still do that, system dynamics. I'm actually developing one called Minsky. But the usage of that is virtually zero at the top levels of government. And what you have is individuals being selected on the basis of their popularity rather than their capacity to think in a systemic way. And out of that, you get people like Donald Trump becoming leaders of the major country on the planet, where narcissism is his main character, rather than a capacity to think in a systemic way. Until we get that at the very top of our organisations, we're going to be completely unprepared for the systemic crises we now face, of which climate change is by far the most serious.
Right. But we do see some governments who do want to at least move towards more sustainable policies, and taking on private stakeholders is one of the key things to do here. How can they incentivize these companies?
Well, I think the incentives are going to come again too late. If we're relying upon the market to generate the signals that lead to the changes in behaviour by these corporations, then the market is not going to react in any way near the speed necessary to let us respond. We're seeing, of course, the coronavirus right now, which there's no way that the market is going to respond before the coronavirus. It responds after. And then the thing is, you need to make your responses before these things happen. I'm sure that they're going to happen in China, is they will probably shut down, ban, and effectively exterminate wildlife wet markets, which is where this particular disease originated. That's not the sort of thing a market economy can do.
Right. I'm on the point of technology here, and quickly, your view on how social media, if all, is and can be regulated given the business model that exists right now. Now, we're seeing how people all across the world, their freedom of speech is declining. There is greater surveillance. A lot of that has to go back to how social media has been used as a tool for this. Now, with this growing dissent, do you think things will change?
I think things will change, and I think it's the conversations that we are still having that are going to obviously affect those change. I think that any restriction of social media in that way is going to be met with a large amount of pushback. We have seen that it has been effective over time, like going back from the Arab Spring and events like that. But whether or not large companies will come in to repress that, whether or not the government will take that with the new view and actually try and what can or cannot be said on social media, I don't see that happening in the near future. There will be such a pushback with it because it is a powerful tool, even if there is so much of it, that it would be very surprising if that gets shut down or repressed in any way.
Right, and we're just going to have to wait and see how situations and events unfold in the coming future. We will, of course, keep covering that. Thank you so much, Mr. Adam Smith, for joining us from London, and Professor Steve Keen for also joining us from London. We're going to go for a short break. When we return, we discuss what to expect in 2020 when it comes to freedom of speech and privacy, especially in the digital realm. Stay with us. Welcome back. The watchdog Freedom House has reported in its 2019 review that for the 9th year running, free speech and privacy on the internet declined globally. We take a look today at how the debate between surveillance for the sake of security and privacy for the sake of civil liberties is changing. Joining us for this discussion is Mr. Ricardo Baretzky, who's a cyber expert and president of Cyberpol, the international cyber policing organization. He joins us from Brussels. Also joining us today is Mr. Andrew K.P. Leung, who's an analyst joining us from Hong Kong. Thank you both for joining us and welcome to the show. Mr. Leung, now we're talking about freedom online, civil liberties. They're almost on a decline for the 9th year running. What do you think is pushing this to happen?
The freedom of expression, freedom of speech, but also the question of privacy. Now, as far as privacy is concerned, which is the main bone of contention as far as the employment of modern technology is concerned, and of course with ubiquitous presence of the internet, and then reaching different aspects of private life. Everybody now has got a mobile phone, and people use emails and the laptop and all sorts of devices, and also even video cameras. I mean, this opens up opportunities for people with different kind of motives to steal data, to intrude into personal privacy. So I think this is a big concern in the 21st century, especially even with the employment of not only the internet, but artificial intelligence, for example, facial recognition. So all these would touch on aspects of privacy, but there's the other aspect, which is, of course, freedom. Freedom of speech. And I think like many freedoms in the world, including freedom of assembly, they are not unbounded. In other words, there must be restrictions because there are, in every society, in every country, there's overriding concern of national security. There is an overriding concern of incitement. So if you express certain views which can incite racial hatred or violence, then obviously any country, including advanced country, even in the United Kingdom, they have a law against incitement. So, and of course, fake news as well. And then as fake news spread, it would cause misinformation and disrupt markets and even disrupt the proper governance of a place. For example, even in Hong Kong, the umbrella movement or the contest.
Mr. Leung, stay with me. Stay with me. I want to talk about what's happening in Hong Kong, the movement there in detail. But before that, I want to jump to Mr. Baretzky and pick up on something that you mentioned here. And now, Mr. Baretzky, there are a number of things that Mr. Leung pointed out towards, and which, of course, are infringing upon civil liberties. But one of the things I do want to talk to you about, firstly, is that of data collection. Now, many scandals unfold over the internet, in the newspaper, about how social media corporations are responsible for some of the biggest data leaks. But what doesn't get a lot of notice is how governments are increasing data collection. Do you feel like that has increased exponentially in the recent years?
Absolutely. I think that the government is, in general, and we see the trend from Cyberpol, because we speak with a lot of governments, that the need for data collection is increasing, one could say second by second or millisecond. The problem that we have, and this is really very serious, is not so much the privacy collection of data, but how the data is used and the protection of the data. We see, of course, that cybercrime is increased. I don't know if you know, we released the figures early this year that estimated 1.4 billion will be lost on cybercrime in EU alone this year, which is almost 3 times from the year before. So the real issue here is how does the criminal world coincide with data collection? And we can tell you that cybercrime is a #1 threat, whether we like it or dislike it. We can see the increase in such a manner that is almost impossible to combat. There is no agency that can combat the crime. The problem the governments face is that they're using the data collection and they don't share it with law enforcement across the world. They use the picture of, we do it in the name of security or national security. But in fact, that is not the case. Most of these data ends up in corporations' hands, private corporations. We have just seen, for example, recently, Facebook and all of the social media companies who collects big data. So the data is used to manipulate public view. So in a way, the data is used to censor public view. And that is a huge concern because freedom of speech in itself is disappearing in the same manner or with the same processing. So these factors goes hand in hand, but it drives organized crime on internet.
Right. Now, Mr. Baretzky, you mentioned here how concern, of course, is about the data collection, but more about how the data is being used. I want to go back to that point and talk to you about that first aspect of it, how and where and why data is being collected. It seems like that has stopped being a point of conversation anymore because people have given in to the fact that their data is being collected on a regular basis. Does the concept of privacy still exist?
No. The governments all around the world, and we can tell it again with confidence because I'm very close to many governments, they are collecting most of this data to form a profile about you, the public. And the public is unaware of the type of profile they are forming. With these data collections, we see developments of companies in Silicon Valley, and particularly of AI, artificial intelligence, where these data can determine or literally predict whether you will commit a crime or not. These data is packaged in different ways, and we can also see this in political influence. We have seen with the Trump election, a very good idea how data can be manipulated. And we will see this again in many other parts of the world. With Hong Kong, for example, the other gentleman touched on the issue on Hong Kong. There's a good example of how public data is manipulated in political interest. So this data is not used essentially for protection of public anywhere in the world. Right. And unfortunately, people like Snowden has been very spot on when they came around 2 or 3 years ago and telling us this. Right. The question is, what are we going to do about it?
Right, and that's the question we're going to try to answer. I want to get back to what happened after Edward Snowden gave out this information about how people's data is being accumulated without their knowledge. How has everything changed since then. But Mr. Andrew K.B. Leung, now, as was mentioned, a lot of this data is used to profile individuals, and going against this profiling has been one of the most integral aspects of fighting for civil liberties, for you not to be profiled, not for the procedure of preventing crime or any other aspect. Is facial recognition undoing all of that?
Well, of course, we can't push back against the advances of the modern age, the data and information age era. I mean, in the same way that we couldn't resist the advent of the Industrial Revolution or the steam engine. So I think the world is moving on. But of course, the problems is, as we have just touched upon, is the question of privacy, is the question of transparency. To what extent is the government transparent in collecting this data? And also, even if the data is supposed to be anonymous, but some of them with artificial intelligence, and you can't really separate the issue of privacy. And of course, that all sorts of conspiracy theories, whereas the government, it would be in the public interest to be able to predict whether certain crimes are going to be committed. Obviously, it is in the interest of public security, law and order is a good thing. But on the other hand, that can be, there is an overreach, and the overreach is touching upon people's privacy. And the question is that together with the advances of modern technology, the kind of institutions, the kind of monitoring system do not seem to be keeping pace with this advance of technology. And of course, artificial intelligence, 5G are going to change the world. It's going to change our daily lives. And of course, as we have recently seen, the issue of Huawei is raising questions of national security. But on the other hand, Huawei managed to connect everything through the Internet of Things. Now, these are the things of the future. And as I said, it's just like the Industrial Revolution. We are now in the fourth revolution, and we shouldn't resist that. But of course, there are issues of privacy, accountability, transparency. All these have got to be addressed, and then it seems that the public institutions are falling behind.
Right. Sorry to interrupt here, but as you're saying that this is almost inevitable, as was the Industrial Revolution in many ways, is the individual rendered completely helpless in all of this? Their information being collected, them moving with the times, accumulating more and more technology in their homes, but that technology being used to collect data on them, constant surveillance. Is the individual completely helpless in all of this?
Well, I think that to a certain extent, the individual's ability to resist this kind of erosion of privacy is certainly much diminished, because no one can now live in a modern world without a mobile phone. Especially even in China nowadays, you need the mobile phone even for pay for your dinner or buy certain stuff in the supermarket. And now with the advent of artificial intelligence, and then we're seeing all sorts of things, like even we're going to see a cashless society, and even a supermarket without any people. I mean, so that's the future. But on the other hand, the protection of privacy is very, very important. And I think that there are NGOs and individuals who are aligned to that and pressing this agenda.
Right. Mr. Leung, stay with me. I want to also introduce Mr. Philip Ingram, who's a journalist specializing in security and intelligence. He joins us from Birmingham. Thank you so much, Mr. Ingram, for joining us, and welcome to the show. Now, I'm curious to know, what side of the debate do you stand on when we're talking about civil liberties in threat, but also surveillance and security being necessary in order to track crime? Online, we're seeing sites such as 8chan, many other sites emerging which lead to terrorism or at least radicalization. Governments are saying that for that purpose, greater surveillance is necessary, but then it seems to be hindering and almost clamping down on freedom of expression.
Well, this is where it crosses the boundary. And I think we have to understand that there's a balance between the rights of the individual for complete and utter privacy and the needs of the state who are charged to make sure that people are protected and kept safe, and there needs to be some form of independent oversight. So the important things with regard to the application of surveillance, no matter where it is in the world, should be that it's necessary, that it's proportionate, and that there's some form of independent oversight. Unfortunately, we've got some governments who interpret those characteristics in very different ways, and there's no such thing as independent oversight in some countries around the world. But I think going on to the debate that you had just before I came on, where you were talking about individual rights, I think it's important that the individual understands today what their digital exposure is online and take steps to make sure that they minimize that or only expose what they want to get. Hundreds of years ago, we knew that if you put a door into a building, it would stop people coming in, it would stop people seeing in. You put curtains on your windows, it stopped people seeing through the windows. We understood what our physical exposure is. We now need people to understand in this increasingly technologically enabled and necessary world what their digital exposure is.
Right. And when you're talking about people need to take that account, their digital exposure, that's one of the things that is also debated. Does this make a difference when individuals put up more ways of trying to protect themselves? I mean, it's almost all around us. Digitalization is almost necessary for us to operate in the modern world. That's a point that Mr. Leung was pointing out towards. So is it even possible to limit your digital exposure?
Oh, very much so. It's people have to decide what they put up on social media, on Facebook, on Twitter, on anything else. If there's a good rule that I tell people in the UK: if you're not happy that anything that you expose in your social media profile, if you're not happy to put that as a poster in your local supermarket for everyone to see, then why put it online? Because everyone's going to see it. And it's the same thing when it comes into your business exposure, your everything else. It's recognize that if someone wants to get access to material that you're going to put and process online, whether it be a nation state or whether it be a criminal, then they can get access to it. So you have to therefore work on the premise that your data will be exposed and work back from that to make sure that you put the measures in place to protect those essential bits of data, because not everything is essential. People walk down the street, people will walk along the beach in various different types of undress, depending on where they are and what country they're in and all the rest of it. So people will expose themselves in different ways in a physical environment. Recognize that you have to have methods of doing that in a digital environment, and it's the understanding of that. But it's where states have the ability to abuse that, and there's no form of independent oversight. That's where the real difficulties start to come in.
Right. Mr. Baretzky, as we've been talking a lot about this idea of surveillance and national security, now the point here is to wonder and ask, throughout history and when we see records of how it's unfolded when governments and states take all this information, is there ever actionable intelligence gathered from all this surveillance?
The answer would be no. And let me explain to you why. First of all, we live in an age of symbiotic intelligence. We are past the stage of artificial intelligence at least 5-6 years. And this is something not talked much at the moment in public yet. I foresee that it will be talked a lot about in the future. Now, what is symbiotic intelligence? Well, let's assume that artificial intelligence has got the ability, like we discovered last year, roughly 8 months ago. I think I've mentioned it before in public, when we discovered Facebook's algorithm changed itself. That was without any human interference. Now, that is an indicator of what symbiotic intelligence is. But what can it do? Assume the following, that the algorithm of any major state player can change itself. And what can it do when it has access to the data? Well, is anybody's data protected? The answer is no. DQ 2.0 was a good example. We know DQ 2.0 was not written by a government, cost around about 100 billion to do, and still today nobody knows who wrote it. Well, it's a big possibility it's done by an artificial intelligence or a symbiotic intelligence. These are the dangers we have to focus on. So can we turn the clock down and switch it all off? Well, it's not possible. What makes DQ 2.0 so important? Because DQ 2.0 runs in electrical walls, With other words, if you have an electricity wire anywhere in the world, can be infected. We know that Decree 3.0 attacked London Heathrow Airport 18 months ago. But again, the alarming walls, or it's written on the walls, but nobody's paying attention to these big alarms coming out. And this is where the danger is. We are way past a stage where government can control the data they've collected, or even in control of collecting data. They have no control. It's time that the World Federation of Governments gets together and realize the danger that this is mutated in the global society. Now, if elections can be manipulated by social media, what prevents an artificial intelligence or symbiotic intelligence to manipulate the same? It should have far devastating effects. We can see coronavirus. How do we know for sure this is not manipulated? There's a lot of questions what artificial intelligence can do if it mutates, and we know for sure it has mutated. The question is, what does it hold in the future for our human race? The security, global policing, cyber policing, and combating cyber threats.
Right. Mr. Ingram, now, Mr. Baretzky made a number of interesting points here. I'm curious to know your take on them.
Well, I think that there are three aspects of security. There is public security, there's national security, there's privacy security. And I think that not only the individual need to be alive, that this is the age we're living in, and it's impossible to turn the clock back. So the individual needs to be more vigilant, needs to be more educated on these risks. As far as the governments are concerned, there are certain things which they can regulate. And of course, that as I pointed out, the kind of regulations and institutions are not catching up with the advances of technology like artificial intelligence or even 5G. So how are you going to, the government needs to wake up to all these risks. Now, as far as, again, the kind of national security is concerned, there is also a kind of, could be pushed to the other side and intruding on personal freedoms as countries or governments can manipulate the kind of data or can manipulate the control so as to, for political ends,
right.
so as to suppress the freedom of the people.
From what you're saying, it just reminds me, and I want to get this question in before we have to move towards ending the show. How have the Hong Kong protests in link of facial recognition, what has changed there ever since that the protests began? What alarm has been created? What has been learned?
Well, as far as Hong Kong is concerned, I don't think that facial recognition has been used a great deal in Hong Kong. I mean, it's not here yet, but of course it's used on the mainland quite a lot. But of course that Hong Kong is a cosmopolitan country, like as in case of London, there are lots of surveillance cameras per unit of population. And obviously, on the one hand, this would help the government to control the kind of riotous or behavior or criminal behavior. On the other hand, is seen as encroaching on privacy. So it's always a question of balance. Whereas the personal freedoms is important, but all these security issues, which I've mentioned, are equally important. I think that calls for the cooperation between the individual, the society, the international community and governments working together.
Right. Mr. Philip Ingram, I want to get a last comment. Now, you've been hearing the discussion going on here. Now, you've heard what Mr. Baretzky has to say, what Mr. Leung has to say, trying to see how social movements have been unfolding, the use of artificial intelligence throughout the world for many social issues, many concerns. What do you see happening in 2020?
Well, in 2020, I see a greater use of artificial intelligence. I see a greater manipulation of what President Trump loves to call fake news, but the information that's being presented to people to try and make a decision and trying to influence the way they're going on. But this is an advanced sort of advertising in the modern era, except it's based on much more sophisticated algorithms that can help change people's behavior. And therefore, I think governments need to play a catch-up game very quickly quickly to understand the level of manipulation that there can be out there. But also individuals need to take responsibility for what's going on and get a greater understanding of what is being presented to them, and only rely on sources of information from reliable outlets rather than anything that's being fed to them on social media on a minute-by-minute basis, and take a step back and start to read reliable outlets, read the newspapers, listen to reliable news, and don't base opinions on the scaremongering that we're hearing. There are no artificial intelligence systems out there at the moment that are completely autonomous, that are changing the way they look at things by themselves, and have got no human oversight or interaction with them at all. They're computers with computer programs and human operators at the end of the day that are interpreting the data. So there's the scaremongering that the robots are taking over the world isn't there at the moment. That's not to say it's not going to be there in 10 years' time, but it's not there today. So there's too much scaremongering going on. There's too much false information being presented, and it can be presented faster and in a more believable way, and we just have to realize that.
Right. We're going to unfortunately have to end at that very interesting point that you put out there, Mr. Ingram. Thank you so much, Mr. Philip Ingram, for joining us from Birmingham, Mr. Ricardo Baretzky for joining us from Brussels, and Mr. Andrew K.P. Leung for joining us from Hong Kong. Thank you for watching Indus Special. We will see you again tomorrow with more stories. Till then, goodbye and take care.